studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
Tonight, a conversation with the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. He is a native of Illinois, a graduate of Princeton, and he served in the Navy as a pilot. He later went back to Illinois and got elected to Congress. He was quickly identified as a young man to watch by the Nixon administration. He gave up his seat to serve as the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity and assistant to the president. He also served as U.S. ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Brussels. After President Nixon's impeachment, Donald Rumsfeld was appointed Chief of Staff to President Gerald Ford. His deputy was a young man from Wyoming named Dick Cheney. Rumsfeld then became the youngest Secretary of Defense, and Dick Cheney became Chief of Staff. After the election of President Carter in 1976, Rumsfeld went on to have a successful business career and sat on several important commissions having to do with America's role in the world. President Bush and Vice President Cheney brought him back for his second tour of duty at the Pentagon in 2001 when he became the oldest Secretary of Defense. Before 9/11, he began his efforts to modernize the American military. After 9/11, he became one of the principal architects of the strategy in Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq. He is the architect of the military strategy and was said to have had strong political battles with then Secretary of State Colin Powell over some key policy issues. Secretary Powell was succeeded by National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice at the State Department at the beginning of the second Bush term. Donald Rumsfeld remains at the Department of Defense and is not known to have any intention to retire. He is a youthful 73, works at a stand-up desk, and has more energy than almost anyone around him. He is a survivor, but also a consummate Washington power player. He writes what are known as snowflakes, his ideas on the go. Sometimes they are hard-edged questions in which he frames crucial issues for consideration by the Pentagon, such as, are we winning the war or losing the global war on terror? Is the Department of Defense changing fast enough to deal with the new 21st century security environment? Here is a man who came to the Pentagon to change it, and he may have, but his preoccupation since 9/11 has been the war on terror and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He thinks broadly beyond his own mandate about America's leadership in the world, the challenge of a new century with global terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and the rise of Asia as an economic powerhouse. He has in his stand-up desk a memo written in 2001 before the war in which the president saw and in which he talked about all the things that could go wrong in Iraq, many of them which did and many that did not. They include the reaction of Syria and Iran to the war, the possibility of conflict between Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds, and other things that have become a reality. It shows that at least he was raising for himself and the president the things that could go wrong, asking important questions. The question is whether the secretary and the administration acted and executed on their own admonitions, and where are we today in the war in Iraq, and what does it mean for our future? That is where we began our conversation at the Pentagon. Can you do what you set out to do and what this country set out to do in Iraq?
Well, time will tell. We believe so. There's an awful lot of evidence that it can be done and is being done. It's always mixed in with the evidence to the contrary. The fact that it doesn't take a genius to strap on a suicide vest and go kill 30, 40 Iraqi people, or attack an Iraqi police station, or put an explosive device on a road and kill some coalition or American forces. And that's what we see. Of course, what's also taking place is that the schools are open, the hospitals and clinics are open, they have new textbooks, they have a stock market. In some 14 out of 18 provinces, the level of violence is very, very low. Most of what's occurring is occurring in 4 provinces, one of which is Baghdad, so from a population standpoint, they're larger. But there's a great deal going on both sides of the equation. And
good and the bad.
The good and the bad, and the fact remains that the people that are there are very confident that it can be done. They're very proud of the work that's being done. They see progress. They're taken by the fact that the progress isn't seen back in the United States or elsewhere around the world.
What do they mean by that? Because you do hear this notion that part of the story hasn't been told because
They feel that way.
the Iraqis feel that way.
No, troops.
Oh, the American troops
Sure.
feel that
Sure.
that
Or
they're-
people who visit, members of Congress who go in. They come back and they are struck by what seems to be a difference between their impressions and what they found there.
They don't find, what is tell me what they don't find that they thought they'd see.
It's a balance. It's a matter of balance, and they come back feeling that the situation is better than they had perceived it, having not visited, and that's a generalization, but I think it's a fair one.
And you buy it. You believe it.
Well,
Things
I know
are better than the perception.
I think so.
Yeah. Because we hear much talk about a reassessment of the mission. Robin Wright had an article in the Washington Post.
Oh, that doesn't make it so.
I
My
understand.
goodness
But
gracious.
nevertheless, that is an argument that you hear being made that there
We
is
hear
Lord.
we hear much talk. Now, Charlie, really, you see an occasional article by someone writing a world-class thumbsucker.
Quoting inside sources at the administration, at the Pentagon, and generals and the like.
You can find we've got 137,000
Brave
troops over
troops
there,
there.
doing a wonderful job.
And no one argues that.
Anyone who wants to could go talk to 137,000 people and find every conceivable viewpoint or comment, and then fashion it into a story that fits a preconceived notion.
I'm not even interested in what a reporter wrote. I'm interested in what the Secretary of Defense says and believes.
Yeah.
Is there a lowering of expectation as to what you thought might be accomplished when you launched the invasion against Iraq?
A lowering of expectations, or you said reassessment first.
Yeah,
I don't know of a reassessment.
Okay.
Except to say that obviously intelligent people continuously reassess and take account of changed circumstances. And we're up against an enemy with a brain. It's not a static situation.
Surprising or not?
Of course not. It's everyone knows that. It's just that people tend not to think about it or write about it. But for every offense, there's a defense, and for every defense, there's an offense. And so throughout the history of mankind, we see things constantly changing on a battlefield. That's why the old saying is that no war plan really is doable.
Changes the moment you start.
After the first contact with the enemy, and that's what's going on out there.
Okay.
And it takes people calling audibles, and they are, and they're doing a very good job. General Abizaid, and General Casey, and General Vines, and the troops.
Here, let me make this point, and I'm trying to understand. No one is questioning, anywhere, the greatness of the Americans and the coalition forces, and any of that. They are asking, though, circumstances change, and
Sure.
therefore, have there been a lowered expectation? One example has nothing to do with the military. The revenue you might get from the oil, has that much less than you expected? The nature of the political process, is it moving as fast and is having the consequences you hoped it would have? 3, the intransigence of the insurgents and the amount of support the insurgents are getting. 4, are they getting more and better bombs to put on the roadside than you expected? So therefore, security situation, economic situation, political situation is not exactly what you hoped it would be at this time.
In October, before the war ever started, I sat down and wrote a list of things that could go wrong, that could be problems. And if I happened to last weekend look at that list, and I read through it, and I found things that never happened, that could have happened, that would have been terrible. So there, the realization was better than the expectation or the possible expectation, and vice versa. There were things that occurred that were worse than one might expect, but they're both ways. I mean, we could have had. You mentioned the infrastructure and the oil. You think what they did to Kuwait's oil wells? They set them all afire. We were very concerned that could happen in Iraq. It did not happen. We were concerned about Fortress Baghdad, where it could go on for weeks and weeks and weeks with a last stand in Baghdad. It didn't happen. We were concerned about the bridges all being blown, and a number of them, in fact, were wired with explosives, but were that was prevented. We're worried about mass migration of refugees and human suffering and starvation and internally displaced people. Didn't happen. Now, what has happened? You asked about the explosive. Yes, indeed, they're increasingly sophisticated. They're increasingly lethal, and our folks are increasingly better at discovering them and reducing the lethality. So if in a given time frame there's 500 that are noted, found, or exploded, only maybe 100, 150 would involve casualties for either coalition or Iraqi people. So they've gotten quite good at finding them and quite good at blowing them up in a way that they don't harm people. So it's both sides of, the answer to your question is you find it both ways. Things that are different and worse and things that are considerably better or things that did not go wrong that might
Okay,
have.
so on the one hand there were no oil fields were set on fire. On the other hand, the oil revenue is not what you might have expected.
Well, I would say this, the general infrastructure of the country was worse than one had estimated.
Is it better now than it was before the war started?
It had been starved for funds for a long period of time during Saddam Hussein's regime. So you have a very fragile electrical system. You have a oil system that is not anywhere near what it could have been or should have been.
Let me ask this. You are famous for almost a sense of asking important questions of yourself and for the people that are part of the mission. I don't have to remind you.
They're hard questions.
They are.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have some of them here with me in terms of the kinds of things that you asked at one time in October. And this leads to a question in which you basically said in a memo, are we winning or losing the global war on terror? Mm-hmm. Is DOD changing fast enough? These are the kinds of things you would expect leadership to ask of itself.
They're not pleasant questions to have to ask.
And the answers are not easy to find.
That's for sure.
Is the U.S. government changing fast enough? Is global terrorism, the record seems to be mixed results with al-Qaeda. This was in October.
Of what year?
October 2003, and there's some progress clearly with respect to al-Qaeda.
Indeed.
Do you believe Musharraf has done everything he can to help you find Osama bin Laden?
That's a tough question. I have met with that gentleman a number of times. I've come back frequently and said to myself, he has to have one of the most difficult jobs on the face of the earth. They've tried to kill him any number of times. He has a country that is not terribly supportive of his decision to participate in the global war on terror. There are a number of madrasa schools there that train people to be suicide killers and extremists, violent extremists. He has done so much and been so helpful in the global war on terror, in the global coalition of countries. He has gone into the tribal areas for the first time in history, that the government of Pakistan has gone into these border areas that had been previously almost sovereign, although theoretically a part of Pakistan. He has gotten very good control of his urban areas and been successful working with other nations, including ours, in arresting and in imprisoning people who were extremists and violent.
Those are all good things, and the U.S. has now had a better friend. Is he doing everything he can to find
and of course
Osama bin Laden?
The answer is we don't walk in his shoes, and we can't know the answer to that question. But we can know that he has to make a calculation as to how far he can go before something happens that there's an attempt to change his government or a sufficient level of opposition to what he's doing that he can't be helpful at all.
You seem to be giving him a pass by saying if you walk in his shoes, you might not expect him to do all that he can because of the risk to himself.
Well, he may be doing, I would say he is doing all that he can. If by can, you mean that's reasonable to expect of a person who's presiding over the country he is presiding over at this moment in history. I give him very, very high marks. And at the same moment, say to myself, I wish something else could be done, or I wish some additional pressure could be done. But the level of cooperation between our two countries is excellent.
In the end, I wouldn't expect Osama bin Laden to be caught alive, would you?
Oh, I don't have an expectation there. You know, we've been looking for people on the FBI most wanted list for decades and not found them. I assume he's alive. I don't know what country he's in, but you have to know.
Best guess is either Afghanistan or Pakistan, isn't it?
You have to know he's spending most of his time hiding and trying to figure out a way he can communicate and move around and do things, and he's not a terribly successful leader at this stage, one would think. Pressure's enormous on him.
Back to your questions in October 2003, and my question
That's
is,
my long, hard slog memo you were talking about.
Yes. Snowflakes, I think, was somewhere in there.
Yes. Yeah.
What is snowflakes?
Snowflake, I use a dictaphone, and when things I want done come to mind, I dictate a little note, and there's so many of them that they call them snowflakes.
Here's what I want to know, and I think it would be interesting for America to know. What are you asking yourself these days?
I'm still asking the question that was in the memo you referred to, and we know that our task is to recognize that this is a long-term proposition. The struggle against violent extremists is not going to be fast. It is a struggle taking place within that religion, and the moderates are vastly outnumber the violent extremists. But the task is going to be a tough one, and we know that they are training additional people continuously in these schools, taking young boys and no other education and sticking them in these schools and training them to be extremists. And we know how harmful that is to the world, to the civilized society. We know that our task is to put pressure on the terrorists, and we are. It's harder today for them to move around, to raise money, to recruit, to retain, to communicate. Everything's harder for them. And a great deal has been accomplished in reducing the number of instances where they can kill innocent men, women, and children. What we don't know is how many people are still being trained, how many people are still going through
Whether the more you kill, the more they produce.
The implication of your question is that there's a relationship. I don't know that that's true.
I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just saying that...
I'm suggesting I don't know the answer. Yeah. I know how many we're capturing and how many we're killing. What we don't know is how many are coming in the intake and being trained to go out and replace those people.
Do you know if they have more incentive to do that today than they did 3 years ago?
No.
You don't think they do, or you don't know?
I don't know. Don't know.
Will you interrogate them so you find out?
We do. We find out a lot.
What do you find out?
I wouldn't say that I think they have a greater incentive. I think there are a mixture of incentives and disincentives.
Okay. Let me come back to the thing. I mean, what bothers you? What is Donald Rumsfeld sitting here, who's been on the mission from the beginning, who thought through it, who planned it with his generals and as the agent of the President of the United States? What's in his head today? Yeah, what do you worry about? And what questions are you asking yourself? Are you saying to yourself, man, this is much tougher than I ever thought it might be? Are you saying this insurgency is going to last longer, and what we have to do is figure out a way to better train the Iraqis, because in the end it's their battle, but that's not going very well, and it's, you know.
See,
have we made some mistakes here? Was it wrong to go in there? Is it doable? Is it doable?
I believe it is.
But do you ask yourself that?
I believe it will be done, and that the people involved, the soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen, the coalition countries and the Iraqis, will look back in 5 or 10 or 15 years and feel they've been a part of something truly historic. And if that's true, if it is a success, and I believe it will be, you will have a country that has resources, that has intelligent people, that has size, located right in the center of that region, and it will have an enormously beneficial effect.
That was the idea from the beginning. That was the idea
It
from
was
the beginning.
part of the idea from the beginning. No question. I mean,
Create a functional
Saddam-
democracy in the middle of the region.
But Saddam Hussein was shooting at our airplanes and at British airplanes almost every week.
Yeah, but that's not why you went after him.
But I mean, here was a man who would use chemicals against his own people, chemicals against the Iranians, who filled mass graves with tens of thousands of human beings. This was a person who was a great harm and threat in that region. To replace that with a representative system, a system that's respectful of male and female, of all religious sects, and have that be an example in that part of the world would just be a truly wonderful thing for this society.
And a truly terrible thing if what ended up was worse than you ever imagined, whatever that might be.
You mean you're back at Iraq now?
Yeah,
I was talking about the global war on terror more broadly, but
yeah, I'm back at Iraq on that. I mean, you believe it can be done?
I do.
Do you?
I believe
And
it
it's
is
very
being
important
done.
for you because, not to put words in your mouth, but I've heard this in offices like this in Washington. You know, you could never live with yourself if you ever believed that these brave young men and women had died for something that was not achievable.
Oh my goodness, exactly. You have to believe it's achievable. And you have to look at the evidence, and you can see the progress that's being made. I mean, if one thinks about it, you've gone from a governing council to an interim government to a transitional government. They're drafting their constitution. I believe
Not on time, and you had to go over there and say to them, let's make some compromises here. This is too important, and let's get on the schedule.
Sure, and it's tough business drafting a constitution. Look at the many months it took our people.
Longer than months.
That's right. So democracy is not easy. It's hard. There's a lot of pulling and hauling and shoving and pushing and debating and discussing, and that's healthy. That's not a bad thing. And that's taking place right now.
You believe in the grand scope of history, we will look back and say in Iraq was the battleground for stopping global terrorism?
Oh, it certainly is a key part of it, because right now it is a major central front in the global war on terror. You can succeed, however, in Iraq, and you're not going to persuade the Zarqawis and the Bin Ladens of the world, or the Zawahiris of the world.
Or people in Indonesia and people in
these people
other places in the world.
Are determined, a number of them, to try to reestablish the caliphate,
Okay.
and in the world, and in the broadest sense possible. And they're not going to be signing some sort of a surrender aboard the battleship Missouri. They're not going to compromise. These are people who are determined that they are going to have their way, and that free people may not function as free people in areas that they want to reestablish as the caliphate.
And they are determined to find the most powerful weapons they can to engage in their battle.
Well, we know that. We know they're actively seeking deadly, powerful weapons of mass destruction.
When I talk about reassessment of goals, some say that no longer is defeating the insurgency viewed as the imperative, just to diminish it and to create some circumstance where the Iraqis can take care of them and can establish some kind of balance themselves, because there is a real desire for the United States to move on.
Set aside that for
Okay.
a minute, the question of a desire on the part of the United States.
Right.
We know that.
Right.
We don't go into another country to occupy it. We want to be helpful, and then the American people want their forces brought back home. And
Well,
that's natural.
Well, you especially have been one of those people who've always advocated, occupation is a terrible thing.
Sure, it's an unnatural thing. And if I were in a country that was occupied by another country, I wouldn't like it either. My view of it, however, is this. I have said some things that then somebody would take and misstate. I've said, for example, if one looks at history, you can find insurgencies that have lasted 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 years. And then someone writes a headline and says, Rumsfeld says that Iraq's insurgency could last for 12 years. Therefore, we're going to have our troops there for 12 years, which is utter nonsense. I didn't say that at all. The second thing I've said, which is also a fact, is that in the last analysis, the people of that country will have to ultimately deal with, cope with, and defeat the insurgency. Because there's been terrorism throughout the history of mankind. There's always going to be somebody who's not going to like something. It's their country. And over time, they're going to have the ability to manage the security interests of that country in a way that they will be able to repress and subdue and ultimately defeat that insurgency. And that will take time. Our job is to put them in a position, on a path where they can do that. And that's what we're doing.
And how well are we doing at that?
Well, pretty darn well.
Do you think that by the end of 2006?
I'm not going to set dates.
Okay, but I mean...
There's so many variables. Let me explain why I can't set it.
Okay.
Everyone who's ever tried to predict the length of a war, the dollar cost of a war, or the number of casualties in a war has been wrong. Why? Because there's multiple variables. Take the situation in Iraq today. If you can tell me precisely the degree to which Syria will be helpful or unhelpful in the situation in Iraq, whether they'll continue to allow people to come into the country and allow financing to go into the country and weapons to go into the country or not, and the same thing with Iran.
Yeah, but they're doing a different thing, though.
It's different, but
Right.
each has been unhelpful.
Right.
Now, we don't know what they're going to be doing prospectively. Are they going to get worse or better in terms of their behavior? So those are variables. The intensity of the insurgency will be partly affected by that.
Suggesting the insurgency would die without the jihadists coming in there, that the Baathists couldn't do it alone.
I didn't say it would die.
Okay.
You're polarizing the thing, and I'm using subtlety here.
I know, I was much too precise.
The second thing that has
And evasive.
Yeah, a second thing that has an effect is the progress on the political side. And if you're an Iraqi and you believe that you've had a chance to vote, as you did January 30th, and elect people who then draft a constitution, and then you get a chance to vote on that constitution October 15th, then you get a chance to elect people under that new constitution, you begin to have a different stake in the country. And it is less of a foreign occupation, and it is more of the Iraqi people having their own country and their own say in it. Now that's a big step. That means the insurgents have a problem. They now are no longer going to be against a foreign coalition. They're going to be against the Iraqi people who have voted for their constitution and then elected people under that constitution. So they're anti-Iraqi, not pro-Iraqi. And that's going to have an effect on the strength of the insurgency, one would think.
The problem, how much of, I've talked to soldiers, and they, when I ask them, is Rumsfeld sending you all the troops you need? Mm-hmm. And they'll say, are you asking for more? And they say no, mm-hmm. most of the time. Mm-hmm. And they say, it's not that we couldn't use them, they say in some answers. It's because an overwhelming display of American troops here is not necessarily productive.
Mm-hmm. The President and I have both told the commanding generals that we will favor a level of troops that they believe is appropriate. And we have from the beginning. The external critics who've criticized the number of troops and saying we've got too many or we've got too few, that's their privilege to criticize. But the fact is, we have provided the number of troops that the commanding generals have asked.
Okay, but I'm saying the reason they don't ask for more is not because they can't use them, it's because of the display of American troops there.
It is a tension
counterproductive
between
and creates tension.
The more troops you have, the more combat support you need, the more logistics you need, the more force protection you need, and the benefit you get from an additional increment is outweighed by the heft, the weight, the footprint, the intrusiveness of having too many. And if you talk to Iraqis, they're anxious to have us be less intrusive, but they don't want us to leave too soon.
Because they're not yet ready to bear the burden.
Exactly.
I'm looking for words like exit strategy, and you say when the Iraqis can carry the burden of being able to handle the security situation and when the political process is meeting its deadline so people feel like they have a government that represents them. And you don't want to set a deadline.
No, who's smart enough to know how all those variables are going to interact and net out? I'm not.
When you look at the challenge of training the Iraqis, is it going as well as you hoped it would be? Because Senator Biden has numbers and you have numbers and,
oh, listen, that's nonsense. Biden throws numbers around like that are not rooted in fact. Let me put it graciously like that. The numbers are the numbers. We don't create them. They come right out of the Iraqi forces, and they're being calculated by the general in charge, General Petraeus.
But he's no longer there.
General Casey, then, if you want.
No, I don't mean to be.
Well, I mean, he's been there for a year and whatever it's been, and he'll be replaced by General Dempsey at the right moment. And those numbers are their numbers, and they are correct numbers. And the documents we give the Senate are footnoted and annotated. And it's perfectly possible for anyone to take a comprehensive report like that, pull out some fact, wave it around, and try to make a charge about it if you're a politician and if you're running for public office. And that's what's going on. The facts are the facts. And
Biden is playing politics with the numbers of Iraqis?
I can't go to his motives. All I'm just telling you, he's a politician and he's using those numbers. And I stick with the numbers that General Casey and General Petraeus give us. And they're very clear and unambiguous.
And what are they?
It's a report about that thick, and it shows how many policemen and how well they're equipped and what the problems are, how strong the ministries are, what the numbers of different categories are, the Border Patrol, the Army, the Special Police Battalions. It goes into each one of these. And they're there for people to look at and understand.
With respect to the American money that's spent over there, funds that have gone over, has corruption been a significant problem?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, corruption in that part
money
of the
coming
world,
over in suitcases and all of that.
Corruption's a problem in that part of the world no matter where you look, and if you throw a war on top of it and create a combat zone, then you've got even more opportunities for corruption. So I think reasonable people have to assume that that's a part of what's going on.
Another word that we hear is civil war. That when you have the Kurds and when you have the Shia and when you have the Sunni and when you have the Kurds and the Shia looking for, quote, special status, and you have the Sunnis feeling like we've been on top and now we're on the bottom, it's going to fall apart because there is no, quote, strong man or woman to bring it together.
Yeah, I mean, there have been people predicting a civil war for 2 years.
But what do you think? I mean, that's why I'm interested.
Well, there hasn't been one. That's a fact.
And nothing would serve the insurgents better.
They have been trying to foment a civil war. There's no question about that. We've seen evidence of that. They're trying to get one sect against another sect. Quite the contrary is what's been happening. It's always a risk in a country like that when you have those deep divisions. And you had the Sunnis on top all those years, and subjecting the Shia to very difficult circumstances. One would have thought when the election was over and the Sunnis didn't participate that the Shias would have said, okay, now it's our turn.
Yeah.
They didn't. They reached out to the Sunnis and said, we want you to participate because we want a single country. So just the opposite. Instead of the Sunnis saying, okay, we didn't participate, therefore we're not going to play, they said, oh my goodness, we probably made a mistake not participating in the election. Now we will participate in the constitutional drafting process. So everything to the contrary is what has occurred. Now, does that mean that the risk is completely gone? No, it's always a risk. Think what they're doing. You're quite right. Saddam Hussein was a vicious dictator, and he used force to repress that country and to keep them in order from killing each other. He killed who he wanted to kill, but they didn't kill each other indiscriminately. Suddenly, it's going to be a piece of paper, not a dictator, not a brutal army.
A constitutional document.
A document, a piece of paper is going to be what they're going to have to put their faith into. That will create a fair situation for them so that they will not be put upon by anybody else. That's an amazing leap of faith in a country like that. That is a gigantic step.
Therefore, the political development is as important as security development, and they work hand in hand.
I believe so.
You mentioned soldiers feeling that the story is not being told. Do you worry about public support for this effort?
Sure. It's a test of wills.
Between?
Our forces are not going to lose a single battle over there. They can't.
Because they have superior
exactly.
training,
they're
firepower.
Oh my goodness, yes. They've got much better military capabilities, their leadership, their training, their experience. They're not going to lose. The only place you could lose this is if you lose the test of wills.
Tell me what the test of wills are.
Well, if in fact people became persuaded that for whatever reason it wasn't worth it, that it couldn't be won. Either it wasn't worth the cost or it couldn't be won.
Some of the conversation you're beginning to hear
One
in
of
certain
those things.
sections.
Oh, sure. It's always been true in every war, my goodness.
Okay, but here in this war is what I'm concerned about.
Well, but I'm concerned also with history. And the fact of the matter is, it's been true in every war. There have people said it can't be won or it isn't worth the cost. And there are going to be people saying that today, and there are. And I believe they're wrong, and I believe they'll be proved to have been wrong. And I believe the American people will, in fact, sustain their support, and that we will prevail.
Even Henry Kissinger has said what he hears reminds him of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
You?
No, not really.
Not the nature of the conflict, but the nature of people beginning to say, this is not worth it. We're in the wrong war at the wrong time.
Well, that's when leadership has to make the case and carry the day, because it is worth it. And if people think you can tuck in and make a deal with terrorists and extremists of that type, and that life can go merrily on its way, it can't. We're in a global struggle against violent extremists, a war on terror, a war against people who are determined that the kind of lives that you live and I live and the American people live as free people, where you can get up in the morning and go where you want and say what you want, send your kids to school and know they're going to come home, that is not the world they want. They want a world of a small handful of clerics telling everybody what to do, and people towing the line and behaving in a way that satisfies their view of what the world ought to look like.
And as you know,
that's a different world.
And in
It's a dark world. It's a world where people behead people.
And a world that is unacceptable to a civilized world.
To free people.
To
it's
free people.
fundamentally opposed to freedom.
Here is the question, though. Is the best way to make that fight, was it Iraq, or was it to stay in Afghanistan? Was Iraq essential in overthrowing Saddam in this understood and imperative battle to confront global extremism?
I believe so.
Because?
Here was a man who was on the terrorist list for years, a man who was giving $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers. Zarqawi was in that country while Saddam Hussein was still in charge of that country. This is a struggle, a conflict, a war that I think is much better fought elsewhere off our shores than it is fought here in the United States. And the pressure that is being put on, a terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique, and there's no way anyone can defend everywhere, at every moment, against every type of technique. Therefore, you have to take the battle to them. You must. You have no choice. There is no safe haven here in the United States. We have to put pressure on terrorists all across the globe. That's why the president put together a 85 or 90 nation coalition, the largest coalition in history, of countries that are sharing intelligence, cooperating, doing a whole host of things together to put pressure on terrorism.
And that battle will be won.
I believe so.
But it is not. It is a long
It is a long
twilight.
I'm afraid it
trouble.
is. It's not something that's quick and easy.
At the same time, there are other huge issues in the world. And you were recently, in the last 6 months, made a speech in Singapore, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me how you see this government confronting the question of the peaceful rise of China when you see conversations about Russia and China having bother you?
Well, let me put it this way. The People's Republic of China is an old country. It has a important history. It's a sizable nation. It is going to be a factor in the world one way or another. And I look at it and I see a tendency towards a freer economic system because of the desire for growth. And to do that, you have to allow people in your country. You have to have computers. You have to have communications. If you're going to want to grow, you're going to have an increasingly freer economic system.
So an open society economically will change the political structure.
One or the other will. Either they will decide that they don't want that growth and try to restrict their openness of their economy, in which case they will not grow, they will not be as successful as they otherwise could be, and they would do it to preserve a dictatorial communist rule. Or, as you suggested, the openness of that system would over time affect the political system.
You think that's an open question?
I do.
You really do?
I do. Yeah.
That as far as they've come in terms of joining the world as an economic power and partner and trader and going out making all the deals they can.
I think that's a good thing.
You think they can put that back in terms of fear over political power?
I think it'd be very hard. On the other hand, repression works. And you can have a repressive system that can, in fact, crimp economic growth, restrict the free press, restrict freedom of movement and action, restrict computers and communications.
Which they are doing.
Which they do. Now, there's a tension there. And one side's going to win.
Yeah.
And I'm betting on the freer economy ultimately prevailing. And that our task is to interact with the People's Republic of China in a way that encourages them to enter the world in a peaceful manner without the grinding of gears.
That ought to be our strategy.
Exactly.
Encourage and to engage them. Do you worry, though, while all of their aspirations seem to be economic?
Well, no, they're investing quite a bit in defense.
I know they are.
Yeah.
That's my saying. While the aspirations appear to be economic,
Yeah.
that they have at the same time a global military strategy to go beyond their region.
Well, they're certainly purchasing a lot of weaponry from Russia. They're increasing their defense budget in double digits. And they're deploying increasingly powerful and longer range weapons. Towards what end, for what purpose, time will tell. But they're certainly not a global threat today. Militarily. They're a regional power today.
But do they want to be?
Well, time will tell. There's going to be this tension.
And we can affect that.
Well, the world can affect it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they'll make the decision. They'll make the choices. And on the one hand, if they make the right choice and decide they do want that kind of interaction with the world and a behavior pattern that is seen as civil to the rest of the world, then they're not going to be a threat to the world. To the extent they make the other choice, then their economy is not going to grow as fast. Their defense budget won't grow as fast. They will not be as significant a military threat because of that either.
Iran. 10 years it'll take them to have a nuclear weapon if they go full bore?
Oh, I'll leave that to the intelligence community.
What do you think, though?
I don't think.
It's not tomorrow, the next day.
I'm not going to say. I read all this stuff. People have different opinions, and time will tell.
Any doubt in your mind that that's what they want to do and that's what they believe they have the right to do?
No, there is no doubt in my mind.
They want. And why shouldn't they, if they argue we're a free nation and we look in our neighborhood and there's Pakistan, Israel, India, nuclear weapons?
Well, what should the rest of the world think about it? I mean, the rest of the world looks at Iran and says, well, they're on the terrorist list. They're actively helping Hamas and Hezbollah. They have a technology relationship with North Korea. Why would anyone think that it would be a good thing for the world, for a country with that track record and that set of interactions, to become a nuclear power? And indeed, the UN says, gee, we think that's not a good idea.
They seem, though, with the election of the new leadership and the appointment of the new oil negotiator and the new foreign minister, that the conservatives are in control and that opportunities for engagement may be less than they were at the beginning of the administration.
Certainly the folks in control seem to fit the characterization you've described. It's not clear to me that it's notably different from before. I think the leadership before was on a pretty short leash, and every time reformist instincts moved a certain distance, they were abbreviated.
I want to just talk a few minutes about personal things about you. This idea of coming to this office for the second time
Sure surprised me.
and finding yourself at the center of the most important decisions that affect the future of this country. Any experience, any skill, anything that you wish you'd had that you hadn't in terms of to do the job? Or was this a job that you felt like you were fully equipped to do?
Well, I don't think anyone ever feels they're equipped to do something as difficult as the assignment that has been thrust at our country and the world at this point. That the only way anyone can do any of these jobs that are of this magnitude is if they select good people and people who know things they don't know, and people who have had experiences they haven't had, and create a team of people who can, in an orderly way, address the kinds of problems that are new problems. There's no roadmap for what we're facing in this country.
The world changed in 9/11.
They did, and there's no book you go to and look it up in the index and say, well, this is what you do next. We've had to cope with a set of challenges and threats and issues that are distinctive and new. If you think about deterrence, for example, the goal is to not have a war. That's everybody's last choice. Nobody wants a war. The goal is to deter a war and to prevent it before it happens, so that the loss in lives and the loss in treasure, it doesn't ever occur. We knew how to deter the Soviet Union. Think of the task today of deterring asymmetrical threats, threats that are not big armies, navies, or air forces, that are not nuclear threats, that are threats that come not from nations that have real estate to protect, and not from organizations that have things of value to protect, but terrorists. How do you deter and dissuade people from engaging in that kind of violent behavior that goes after innocent men, women, and children? That is a much different task, and it's a challenge for our society and for the world.
Is the challenge, much has been said about America's image and America's reputation, that it's been damaged by, and certainly within certain parts of the world. Do you accept that, number one? And number two, does it make the job of the future much more difficult?
I think there's always been, whether it's the
Yankee syndrome?
Yeah, the neighborhood or whatever, that there's going to be criticism of the country that happens at that moment in history to be the more important factor and influencer of things. I think it's true also of a culture that's penetrated the world the way our music and our movies have, and people disagree with that. I mean, if you go look at part of what the struggle in the Muslim faith is that.
Yeah, the fundamentalists violently object to our culture.
They really do. Now,
And,
Does it make
and fear the fact that their children are attracted to it.
Exactly. Would life be easier if everyone was cooperative? Of course. Does it make it somewhat more difficult that everyone's not cooperative? Yes. On the other hand, the reality is there are certain things we can only do with the cooperation of other countries. So we have to go out and get that cooperation. And that's why this coalition that's been put together is so important. You can't. How do you deal with the proliferation? How do you deal with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction other than in close cooperation with other countries? You have to have that cooperation.
Donald Rumsfeld, multilateralist.
Of course. Realistic.
Because that's the real world.
It is, indeed.
This, my last question. Here is what would seem to be terribly difficult, and I don't know how you get your hands around it, and I come to you, this memo that you wrote again in October 16th, one of the snowflakes, October 16th, 2003. Today
that was a snowstorm.
Well, you know what it is? I think most people who read this said, here's somebody who's thinking about the big issues and thinking about them in a very serious way. That's the import I had. You say today we lack metrics to know if we are winning or losing the global war on terror. How do we know? And how do we determine winning and losing so that we can make important decisions about deployment of American forces and engagement of American forces?
But just as Iraq is a security issue, it's also political. Progress on the political side is terribly important. And progress on the economic side. People have to see things getting better in the country. So too in the global war on terror. We're putting pressure on them from a law enforcement standpoint, from an intelligence gathering standpoint. But by the same token, we have to succeed in the battle of ideas. We have to find ways to see that the numbers of people being attracted and brought into that system with money or whatever incentives are provided to go out and kill people, that number is reduced. And so we have that struggle, that battle to engage in, and it's one that, frankly, the moderate Muslims are going to have to take the lead in. We can be helpful, but we can't defeat the extremists with ideas. It's going to be the moderate Muslims who will have to prevail in that conflict.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about the world that we live in today.
Good to be with you.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld from the Pentagon for the hour. Thank you for joining us.